Welcome back to the Antilibrary Podcast. This episode is an interview with my friend, Dr. Cristovao Nwachukwu, who is an assistant professor of Africana and Latin American Studies at Colgate University. As you know, in our podcast, we do both original content as well as interviews. This is part of the interview series. So, Cristovao is currently working on a book manuscript tentatively titled Mapping Black Diasporic Mobilities Questions of Space and Place. This book analyzes the representations of Black African immigrants in contemporary African novels that take place in the US and Europe, and the impacts of geographical alienation and trauma in African family units. His writings on Black diasporic literature and culture have appeared in several journals, such as English in Africa, the Journal of African Literature Association, and so on. So, without further ado, let's go to Cristovao. Hi, Cristovao. Thanks for joining us today at the Antilibrary Podcast. We are honored to have you here. So, without further ado, I will go into our first question. So tell us a little bit about your exciting research project and how did you decide to work on African diasporic family units, and how did your thought evolve and your research evolve in this area?
So it's interesting that I started originally with just trying to figure out because I think it started like with my own like personal story of like migration because I was born in Brazil to Nigerian parents and everything, and I came to the United States to do my PhD. So I kind of like thinking so my own interest in like migration and African diasporic literatures came from that, especially because, I think it's kind of like a cliche that trying to figure out my own identity and connection to the continent. And then it started with Ghana Must Go by Selasi and Transcendent Kingdom by Gyasi. And those two novels deal with like family relationships, all Ghanaian, and one is about Ghanaian family, another one is about Ghanaian Nigerian families and everything in the United States. And I said, well, let me just talk about families because I haven't seen that, I don't remember seeing that much about families. I see a lot about identity, otherization, and everything, blackness and difference and everything. So then, after I did my presentation, I said, well, probably the topic of families because as an African, you just know that the family is at the center of almost everything, even like outside of the continent, inside of the continent. I said a lot of people that have been probably have been writing about this, right? And then I started like realizing that not many people at all. Like there was a really big dirt in the and still is a big dirt in the scholarship about not only specifically on African literatures. There's a lot going on in the field right now, but about family formations in the contemporary diaspora. So it started like personally, and then this is like part one of usually my argument that migration changes the like family structures and everything, but also the family at times becomes it's very complex, but at times becomes a means of survival for those African immigrants represented in these novels. At the same time, I was very interested in how these novels represented like geography. So, and then, at the beginning, it was just mostly like in terms of like identity and families. And then I said, well, how do they differ? And said, well, a lot of the novels that I study, some of them take place in the United States, some of them take place across Europe. One of them by Ijeba Shego, that is a Somalian Italian writer. She writes a novel that takes place in both Italy and Somalia. And then the geography, well, you can see that the different geographies and also the different histories that are really going to be, referenced there and going to be explored there in the fiction are going to change the way that these characters are going to deal with like blackness or how blackness is going to be represented. So that's how I said, well, I'm not only interested in like the spatial, like the settings of these novels, but also interested in the social and historical references that are in these novels as well. So that's how I became interested in space, seeing that it really shaped, the different interactions within like family members, how some of the characters, some of the writers are going to portray family as a means of survival. Some of them are going to portray family as a means of strife, sometimes stifling in the diaspora or even like inside the continent. Yeah, so that was the beginning, just like trying to notice exactly what people were already talking about and what I could contribute. And then I said, well, so not many people have been talking about families. This is, how can I continue the conversation that is not being that much explored, I think.
Thank you for that amazing narrative. So, since you have already mentioned space and how different geographies shape blackness and also the dynamics within the family. So, I will segue into a question about space. You define something called local blackness. Could you talk a little bit about that and what kinds of spatial and geographical categories of theories you are talking about in your research, and who are some of the other theorists of space that you are engaging with?
Yes, so I would say so. Let me see if I can start with yeah, so before I think it's better for me to start with the theoretical framework. I think will be becoming clearer because okay, so I started with this and then I had like an attention to, space and geographies. And then I said, what are the fields of the study? Of course, there's a discussion because of the famous like spatial turn in the humanities. There is some of a discussion of space in like African literatures. Akwaeke has written a lot about like space. And African literatures, but I was interested in, okay, so are there fields of study that deal with that specifically? So one of them that I found, like when I was, refining a project was geocriticism. I always call geocriticism the cousin of ecocriticism that that has been getting a lot of attention these days. So geocriticism, the father of geocriticism, is who basically coined the term, I would say, is Bertrand Westphal. And then he published his book on geocriticism, like real and fictional spaces, 2007, was translated in 2011 by Robert Talley Jr., if I'm not mistaken, that's his name. And then it deals with really because there is a difference between, okay, so geocriticism in general is the attention to geographical representations in literature, but it's also an interdisciplinary field. So there are people that study film and visual arts and all of those like different kind of artistics, and also other fields like sociology and anthropology that are, especially geography, that are like within like the geocritic, theory. So, but the difference is something that I really like when I read Bertrand Westphal is that there's the difference between imageology. Imageology will be, it's not like groundbreaking to say, oh, like there is a setting here represented in the novel, and then that has like some kind of like metaphor and meaning. So this has been done like since time immemorial. What geocriticism does is pay attention to what are the like spatial like references to what we call the cultural geographies, what we call the real quote unquote real world. So and then, like for instance, if you're talking about like a general setting, that would be imageology. That would be like general like literary theory that you're using to read like metaphors and whatever literary devices within that space. And then I'm going to give an example of a novel that I studied that is called Black Bazaar by Alan Mabankou. And then it's basically about African immigrants in Paris, and they have this space called Black Bazaar, but there's also several like references to the banlieues. Banlieues are kind of like the slums in Paris and everything. So they kind of like navigate those spaces, but they are also extremely marginalized. They are second-class citizens in Paris, which is known because of the cultural hegemony that France carries across like the globe. Being an imperialist country, it is known as the city, of like love, or the city of this, and then there are like the Eiffel Tower, things that we know like currently, that are part of like the cultural like imaginary. And at the same time, what this like writers like Mabankou, well, there is this, but also this is not exactly those luxurious spaces that some African migrants are going to occupy. And this is what I was interested in. Okay, so geographic criticism really enables me to really make the distinction between like place, which is kind of, a hegemonic view of a specific location. It can be, even a city or a continent and everything, and space. Space really involves heterogeneity, fluidity, some kind of like flexibility that is unraveled when you study a particular representation. So that's what I like was interested in when, and I found out, oh, so geocriticism is what it's really my area of study if I want to pursue this and really refine my research. And then And I wanted something also like more specific to racialization, because of course, like space and otherization is something that, is something that has been explored in like postcolonial studies and like several like other like fields of study. But the racialization of, like Black immigrants from Africa are going to be different from like Arab, racialization of Arab immigrants from Africa and from other places and other populations. I need something that's really speaks to the experiences of people in the African diaspora more specifically. And then doing like some research, I found out about the field of Black geographies. Now, it's interesting that the field of Black geographies is kind of like North American based, and I'm like more in like African diaspora and African literary studies. And usually, I call myself like a Black studies scholar because Black geographies is a subfield of Black studies. But Black studies has been historically focused on the United States. However, like Black geographies, there is a book published by Catherine McKittrick and Clyde Woods that was published in 2007, if I'm not mistaken. That's really collection that they really explain and also invite several scholars of the African diaspora to talk about and define Black geographies, which is basically this the theory that studies the racialization not only of like humans of human geographies, but also of places. So basically, how and one of the things that they open, something that I never forget when I read the book, is that they open talking about Hurricane Katrina, which when you think about it, sometimes it's interesting to talk about like inside the United States, but outside of the United States, the image that you are sold about the empires that the empire and everything is like the first like quote unquote first world country, super developed, everything is great here, and then something that happened in Hurricane Katrina, well, not exactly. You see all of those people that are going to be displaced. They're citizens of the United States, but because they're Black, in a very Black and diasporic space, there's New Orleans, they are kind of became like refugees within their own country. And they opened that. So this is something that Black geographies is really interested in, drawing from like the Black radical tradition, cultural geographies, and everything going to the 21st century, like in human geographies, talking about human hierarchies of racism and sexism, so on and so forth, that we already studied. But also not only in terms of oppression, but also in terms of community formation. So how do communities, for instance, if a good example would be maroon societies, not exactly right now, but historically in the African diaspora of like formerly enslaved people would run away and then form like communities. And nowadays you also have, in my case, I study how those migrants in represented those novels, they are going to sometimes the family itself, the consanguineal family, is not going to work out very well for them to survive. So they are going to turn to the community as a family. So this is how they kind of like use community formation to survive this kind of conjoined oppressions. And because of like all of those like intersections that I deal with, like all of those different geographies, a little bit in the United States and Europe and also across Africa, that there is something, especially when you go to like different places. But let's take to the United States, for instance. There's something called the Black experience. Now it's problematic because there isn't. I think people know, but sometimes they don't want to engage with the idea that there is no one singular Black experience. Because if you're talking about Blackness, there are a lot of people that are going to be racialized as Black across the diaspora. Not only people that are born in the United States, but also migrants from the Caribbean, from Central America, from South America, from like Africa and everything. And even though there are going to be different ways that they're going to be racialized because of their cultures of like origin, their culture of the homeland. And then this is really going to change within different spaces. And it's also going to be different if they are not only Black, but also they are African or they're from the Caribbean and everything. So that's why instead of like calling like Blacknesses, which is that doesn't sound very good, I just feel like this is what we could call like Glocal Blackness. So that's I hope because I make like a big I think it will be better. So yeah, I hope I answered your question. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great way of answering it. And I was just also reminded of a book I read recently. It's called, I'm forgetting the name of the book exactly. It's by Catherine Yusuf, who works on what she called in human geographies. It's
Hmm.
like geology and geography and racialization and so on. Um
But let's move to the next question, which is from your more recent article, where you explore African epistemological and ontological categories such as Ogbanjes and Sankofa in your analysis of the intersection between what you call spiritual and migrant alienation. So could you talk a little bit about this specific article and how you use these categories, but also how that becomes a model for engaging with non-Western concepts and theories in African studies and post-colonial studies?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So this article was probably like one of the hardest pieces I've ever written because so it's based on the novel Freshwater by Akwaeke Emezi, who is a Nigerian writer. And then Freshwater deals with the main character who finds out like throughout the novel that they are Ogbanje, but they do not know exactly that they are that because most of the novel is narrated by like this Ogbanje spirit that is something that is comes from Igbo culture in Nigeria. So the Ogbanje, for the people that don't know, are basically spirits like a child that dies and comes back again. So it keeps like coming back again, and then the child dies, and then keeps going back again, and kind of like there's the repeated cycle of grief. And but the main character doesn't know that until the very end of the novel. So I said, okay, so I don't want to do this because I think it's beautiful written, it's being very critically acclaimed. There has been like several studies about it. And then I started writing about it, I think in 2019, and I actually finished it in 2023. And then I read like Kafka Caru's, unclaimed experiences and everything. So, and I tried to find like a way in. So I saw that as I was close with the novel, I said, this doesn't like this fits in some parts, but when I try to go further, it is like I'm not able to because there's something missing there, and I don't have any ideas of how to actually write a whole article using only the theoretical framework. And then I wrote that in 2019, 2020, kind of paused. And then it's something that I didn't find like a very like comprehensive study about the novel itself. And then, but I said I cannot use because it's based. For the people that do not know like unclaimed experiences, but it's based on like the Holocaust, the Jewish Holocaust, and then there is also, but there's the histories of colonization across Africa and other populations are not really addressed in that book. So it became very specific to like a tragedy that happened in Europe, but it couldn't like fit the history of colonization like across Africa that's tried to decimate indigenous like forms of knowledge and knowledge, epistemologies, ontologies, and everything, which is something that I talked about in the article. And then I said, well, if I want to talk about healing, and maybe I should study more about Okmanjis and everything, their nature, to see if I can find something that deals like with healing and everything. And then I found this article that talks about okay, so that's exactly the issue is that trauma theory does not really fit into like some histories of colonization. Therefore, at times it cannot be used. That doesn't mean that you should never use trauma theory to talk about postcolonial texts. That's not what I'm saying. But there are limitations here that they can be addressed if you want to talk about healing, communal healing, different forms of healing. If you studied that specific culture, so the specificity is necessary. And then when I did that, that's when I was able to, oh my God, I finally am able to write about healing in this novel that it seemed like so impossible to me. So when I addressed the concept of like Ogbanje, and I found out that the Ogbanje is kind of like considered like a marine spirit, it's not only a general spirit, but it's a marine spirit, because a lot of like African cultures, especially, but sticking like more specifically to Nigeria, are like there's this holistic view with nature. It's not we are nature, the fauna is here, the flora is here. We are one with nature. That's what we call like animistic kind of view of nature. And then Ogbanjes are marine spirits, so fresh water really means that if hopefully that's not a spoiler for kind of a spoiler, a mini spoiler if you haven't read the novel at the very end. There's a scene that the main character spills, like metaphorically, kind of is more like an image, spills fresh water out of their mouth. Therefore comes, there's a fresh water, and then them like going like being like a marine spirit is kind of they're going back to their own element because they actually found out, oh, I'm on Ogbanje, but I didn't have the language, I didn't have the knowledge to name what I was, name exactly my connection to the homeland, because this character went from Nigeria to the United States, so they were separated, from, and they didn't grow up in a Nigerian environment. So that's also when I was writing, I said, well, this is something that it comes from the Akan philosophy at Sankofa, which is very used in African diaspora studies, which is the idea is roughly translated as not taboo to look back and retrieve what you need to retrieve, because there's a Ziakara symbol of a bird kind of like looking back and fetching like an egg. So basically, you have to look back into the past to actually figure out your present and your future. And that's what the character needed to do. Okay, so there's this whole histories, spiritualities that have been attempted to be erased by colonization because of like cultural hegemony, or specifically British colonization in Nigeria because of Christianity. And then the novel itself kind of mirrored my own like knowledge at the time about Ogbanje's and indigenous knowledges, Igbo knowledges of like spirituality and everything, that I had to really reconnect, do like the project of Sankofa as an African scholar myself to actually write that article. So, that was a very interesting and very challenging, as you can see, for many years trying to figure it out. And I would say that in general, postcolonial studies, if also there are people in postcolonial studies listening to the podcast, is that the culture specificity is not that it's bad using like Western forms of knowledge. Use your whatever you Foucault and Judith Butler, and use whatever you find useful, in your theory. But at times, there's also one should remember exactly what exactly is said about like traveling theories, that sometimes they're freak. I just read that yesterday. I don't remember exactly what it said, who said that, but there are going to be limitations that are not going to be encompassed by like Western forms of knowledge. And at times you are able to address those limitations being like more culturally specific, and now thinking that in order the knowledge that you're trying to produce or scholarship that you're trying to engage with in order to be validated, it can only be done in one way. There are like multiple ways. And the way that I found is that, okay, so there's something here in trauma theory that is useful, that was useful in the article, but I can go further if I went more specifically into like Nigerian, more specifically into Igbo kind of like cosmology. So yeah, that's the process of writing that article. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great answer. So now I will ask, what are your main teaching areas and how do you see your research and teaching intersected?
So my focus is in African literatures, diasporic African literatures that deal with like with migration, and also like African cultures and everything. So I deal primarily with African literatures and also film. So I'm also have been, especially I'm writing a new article that is about the first film called Akan, that is the considered to be the first film to depict homosexuality in Western Africa, that was released in 1997. So it's something that I it's a very common discussion that we have like in postcolonial studies of having this cultural hegemony in academia, especially in a place in literary studies. At times you ask students, so what are the big authors, and they usually say Shakespeare, Jane Austen, and everything. And even people like in general that are outside of the area of literary studies are going to usually say the same authors. And then it seems like any kind of like from literature from even not from like Africa, from Asia, it seems like, oh, it's optional, but it's mandatory for you to know, who I don't know, Faulkner is, who all of those like big names are. But for you to know who Ngugi wa Thiong'o is, who Lesho Inca, who Novalo Bulawayo is, it's kind of like optional, because it's part of like the inheritance of enlightenment, that is, whatever is like Western, European, everything is seen as the universal, and the specific, it comes from like other, quote unquote, like other cultures, especially cultures from places that have been colonized. So I try to counter that in my classes, really trying to center and trying to really engage primarily with works from like Black authors across the diaspora, especially continental Africans, not only in primary sources like novels and films and even music and also other kind of media that I bring to my classes, but also in theory. So everything that I'm talking about, I have explored in my classes and courses in like different ways. Sometimes, of course, you have to, try doing like trying to do like some scaffolding for students because at times this might be their first encounter with African literature ever, and might be their last encounter with African because some of them read outside the class, some of them, well, like I read it, and that's interesting because they are not exposed to that as much as like I am, because it's not something that they see on TV or they've been taught like in high school. So I've been always trying to, how can I really make a space for, cultures and literatures and culture productions that have been discredited as being okay. So this is not because something that I always find, even talking to colleagues myself, says, "Oh, I never read an African author." It's like, well, it's like, okay, what do you want me to do with that information? And I know that it's something that is a product of like being from like Western academia and everything. That oh, you have to read and know these authors, but these other authors are kind of an extra, and it's not an extra. It's something that people should have a very holistic experience of like literature who writes the kind of like imaginations, the kind of like as Sadia Hartman calls it, like the critical fabulation that Black authors are capable of across the diaspora. Engaging with like different histories and images and their creativity and everything. So I try to bring that and I do bring that to my classes, and I do hope that at times I can see the impact in students that sometimes, oh, I never read anything like this before. I never thought about, these issues or these cultures before. And this is how I usually see uh, my scholarship and also my teaching interacting because I do engage mostly primarily with when I write articles and projects and everything, primarily with like African authors and Black authors from like Black studies, African diaspora studies, and African literary studies. So yeah, that's basically. Yeah.
Okay, great. So could you talk a little bit about your work contributing towards community building or other ways that you kind of engage with the general public? Already you talked about how people have little knowledge and awareness of these major writers who happen to be African writers, but they should be considered as major writers anyway, and everyone should read them. But there is this kind of blind-sightedness towards them, and there is this exclusive focus on certain Western authors. So, how do you see your work contributing towards creating more public awareness beyond the classroom about these important areas?
hmm So there was one when sometimes I try to engage like with projects that would enable me to make African literatures more accessible. And one of them that was very interesting that I think was back in 2022 that somebody when I was doing my PhD at the University of Florida invited me to create like a museum exhibition in Gainesville. So I want you to, and then they said I want you to like pick some like authors and some quotes about love from like Black authors across the diaspora. And then I said, well, I never did that. So, something that was interesting. And then I picked like some books, like I select the books from like Bell Hooks and Aminata Forna, who is a Sierra Leone writer, that is descended from Sierra Leone, and also from Gyasi, a Ghanaian author, and also from Akwaeke Emezi, Nigerian author. So that was something that, oh, this is something that I could do as well to make literatures, African literatures, and also like Black theory and also literature is more accessible to the general public. So that was a very good exercise because after when they had like this whole events about Black love and everything. And then afterwards, there was like the exhibition that I created with the quotes from this book, and people were already interested and saying, "Oh, maybe I could read this, maybe I could read that." Read that, and I saw the necessity of actually engaging with the public and seeing that, well, if we do want to make it more accessible and more like popular outside, not only outside of like academic spaces. We do need to do this kind of work. And when I was still a graduate student, I was invited to give presentations in two high schools back in Gainesville, and it was on Zoom. But I did a presentation on, it could not be like because they were teenagers and everything, so it could not be about theory and everything. So I said why the whole presentation was, why is African literature important? And I talked about, getting to know all the cultures from different eyes, different perspectives. And people, the students were so interested. Oh, like they were asking me questions. How many books have you read in your life? It's like, well, I lost count. I don't know. They were so interested because they saw, like I talked about in general, just I think 5 authors or 6 authors, like from Africa, from South Africa, Nigeria, Ghana, from different places, and sort of like some of the works that they have written. And I saw that a lot of them were very, I never heard about that, you know. So creating this kind of like community engagement, outside of academia, but also like in high schools, like very from like early stages, even look from like children's literature, from like Black authors across the diaspora. It's also helpful so people don't like grow up even like after they get their PhD sometimes, or even just when they graduate from high school, I never read an African author. So yeah, and did I answer a question? That was on the question.
Yeah, it does, and it's very inspiring. So this is my last question for the interview today. What would be some of your advices for young researchers who are navigating academia, especially people who don't come from families with a lot of academic connections, or first generation graduate students, or people from outside the US?
Mhm. I would say one thing that really helped me is trying to find mentors. Trying to first make connections that are not only about like networking with people that are big names. So, go to conferences. This is something that people always tell, go to conferences and try to meet like the big names in your field. There are people that help me that are not really in like African literature, not really doing like African studies at all, but they just help me being just curious about, so how can I support you? And do not say that, oh no, because you're not in my field, so I need to be focused on the big names in my field. But if there's someone that tries to support you and you can notice that they have like good intentions good intentions in general, just see them like as a mentor. With a lot of us, like we need that, especially when you are coming from like a completely like different country and you're dealing with like several things that some people that cannot understand, that are born in the United States cannot understand. So that usually helps a lot. And I would say also knowing your field of study is important. So as you like get into like grad school and everything, you're going to learn exactly what kind of scholar do I want to be. And of course, you do have to know the fields, do the readings that you're supposed to do, uh, you know, but do not be afraid of investing in your own idea. I like, for instance, in my case, I did notice as well that talking about families was not talking about migration because it's always a contentious subject was very appealing to like many people. But when I talk about families, the interested was not people were not as interested because it seemed mundane. But I wanted a topic that was easily, accessible to people that are inside and also outside of academia because everybody has a family, everyone has like a family history. So I invested in that, even though there are some people that said, why about families? Why about Africa? Why about this? Why about that? I just ignored it and said, I'm just going to do what speaks to me. So instead of trying to, I'm going to make up, there's a very big gap in the scholarship. What speaks to you the most? And how can you refine the argument to continue a conversation that probably already exists? And how can you make an intervention that is compelling? Not There isn't always a gap in the scholarship, but there's different ways that you can say the different contributions that you can make to a very long-standing argument or debate within the field. So pay attention to your own voice when you are like entering academia, and do not lose sight of that voice.
Yeah, that's very insightful and helpful indeed. Thank you so much, Cristovão, for doing this interview for the Antilibrary Podcast. We'll stop here.